Pastor Barry started a few weeks ago a series on the book of Acts. And we've worked out a deal. I'm just going to carry on where he left off. And when he comes back next Sunday, he's going to carry on where I left off. We arranged things. So this morning, I would like us to look at Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 42 to 47. And before we read that, I'll read it. You can read it. You'll hear me. The other stuff goes on in your head, in case you're wondering. I want to make a couple comments about something about the book of Acts that is sort of important. The book of Acts is often described as a history, and you need to understand what history meant in the ancient world. The word itself means inquiry. So when Herodotus wrote a history, the question he was trying to answer, the inquiry was, why did the Persians attack the Greeks? And he spent about 500 pages answering that question. When Thucydides, often known as the father of history, wrote a history, his question was, why did the Athenians and the Spartans fight like cats and dogs and basically wiped each other out? Why did that happen? The book of Acts, I would suggest to you, has a question. Luke never tells us what he's trying to answer. But most of us suspect that somebody said to him, Luke, how come the church looks like it looks today? His day. And he tried to explain to them how the church came to look like the church that they knew. And today, we're going to look at a passage that fits into that answer. And the question, if you remember Pastor Barry's sermon on Acts chapter 2, he talked about 2 weeks ago the day of Pentecost, and how on the day of Pentecost the believers were together and the Holy Spirit came upon them, and there was a sound like rushing wind, and they each received what looked like a flame of fire, and they all spoke languages. And what was even more amazing, they spoke languages, and all of the people who were in Jerusalem for the festival of Pentecost heard their own languages. Now, what you've got to remember, a couple things. The people who heard them speaking, 99.9% of them would have been Jewish, with a few Greeks who liked what the Jews believed, but hadn't actually become Jewish. And they're hearing all of these languages. And after hearing the wind and seeing the flames and hearing people speak in their own languages, there were two responses. Pastor Barry explained. Some of them said they're drunk. And some of them said, what does this mean? Some of them knew what it meant. They were drunk. So Peter, this was the sermon last week, Peter stood up and answered their question. What does this mean? And Peter's answer included a passage from the prophet Joel that talked about how God was going to send his Spirit on the people at the end of time. And Pastor Barry explained this very well. And they would prophesy, and the young men would prophesy, and their slaves would prophesy, and their old men would prophesy. Then Peter sort of slipped one in on them. And by the way, you murdered your Messiah. They didn't see that one coming. You murdered your Messiah. And having explained that to them, he ended by saying, ask for forgiveness. Repent of murdering your Messiah. And they did. And they were forgiven by God, and they were baptized, and 3,000 were added to the church on that day. So what did that church look like? Well, when you get to Acts chapter 2, verse 42, what does this mean? And having had Peter tell them, Luke gives us a description of what that church looked like. Now, you're all sitting in church, and I hate to break the news to you, it doesn't look like anything you're seeing around you. Because this was the very beginning, and it was very different. And what I would like to do with you this morning is read the passage. It's going to be up on the overhead. And read the passage and make a few comments, just to help you understand what this would have looked like. Okay? So, verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. They devoted themselves to 4 things. I think I can count 4. Devoted themselves, that's like they worshiped these things. They stuck to these things. They glued themselves to these things. Another way to explain it is they continued to do something with intense effort, and it also tends to imply the possibility that there might have been some difficulty with doing this. But they did it. They kept on in it, and they persisted in it. And what did they persist in? 4 things. The Apostles' Creed, the teaching of the apostles. If you don't know what the teaching of the apostles means, you've got to bear something in mind. I'm standing here with a Bible. They did not have a Bible. They had needed a whole wagon to get a copy of these scriptures with them. It would be like going to church, every one of you with your own wagon, with all your scrolls piled up. And then pastor would say, the passage today is from Acts. And you'd go, well, what am I doing with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? In other words, things are different. What they did have was the apostles. The apostles taught. Another 100 or so years, people actually tried to synthesize what the apostles' teaching was. And you would know it and recognize it as the Apostles' Creed. Now, I would love to do this to you, but it would be considered impolite and embarrassing. Make each one of you stand up and recite the Apostles' Creed. You want to know what the apostles taught? Learn the Apostles' Creed. It's the best summary we have. And that's what they were attached to. That's what they devoted themselves to. Why teach? Why did the apostles have to teach? Well, Peter's answer to the question, what does this mean, tells you why. They all knew the book of Joel. They just never made the connection with Jesus. They never made the connection with a suffering Messiah from the book of Isaiah. Somebody had to explain this to them. Go back into your Gospels and read about Jesus working and talking and teaching his disciples. Why? Well, they might have been Jewish. They might have been circumcised. They might have done the Passover every year, but they still didn't understand it, so somebody needed to explain it. And that's what the apostles were doing. How many apostles were doing the teaching? If you want to say 12, I'm good with that. If you want to read Ephesians, you will discover that God gave prophets and apostles to the church. Implies there might have been more than 12. But that's a debatable point, and that's not what we're here to debate. But the simple fact is, this church did not have a written copy of the Gospels on the day of Pentecost or the week after. They needed somebody to tell them what Jesus said, to explain to them what Jesus said, to have that discussion about what it meant to find a treasure in a field and then rebury it and sell all your possessions and buy the field. What's that about? You need somebody to foster that little discussion and interaction. That's what the apostles were doing. The second thing they devoted themselves to was fellowship. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship. Now, I probably could teach you for weeks about fellowship, and where we would go is the book of Philippians. So read the book of Philippians, and you'll get a really good idea. The word fellowship does not mean potluck. It does not mean overdoing the carbohydrates. Okay? Fellowship does not mean eating. So if you read Philippians chapter 1, verse 5, Paul expresses to the Philippians that he is thankful for their fellowship. Now you're all looking at me, huh? Well, you know that as partnership, because that's what the word fellowship means. It's a partnership. When a group of people get together and have a purpose, whether that purpose is to drain a swamp, farm some land, put their money together to buy a boat full of linen and bring it to the ancient equivalent of Fanny's Fabrics, if you remember what that was. We don't know. It could be all of those things, but they have a partnership. And in the case of Paul and the Philippians, the partnership is the gospel. And as you read Philippians, you discover there are some issues. But where you get into an issue with partnership is when you start turning the partnership not to everyone's benefit, but to your own personal benefit. In other words, you start doing things with your own mind and for your own purpose. And you'll remember, if you read Philippians, how many times he says, be of the same mind, think the same thing, have this mind in you that was in Christ. That's what's involved in fellowship. It's not another reference to breaking bread together. It's not another reference to eating together. It's not another reference to blueberry-covered cheesecake, as much as I like blueberry-covered cheesecake. You with me here? Fellowship is a partnership. And what does that partnership entail? It's partnership around the gospel, where we're all working together. They were all working together to proclaim the whole of the gospel. The third thing they devoted themselves to finally, breaking bread. You need to know something about ancient bread. You could kill a cat with it. The stuff was like rocks. Literally, you had to break it. Okay? We're nice to you here. We're going to celebrate the Lord's table later. and you're going to be receiving a plate with little pieces on it. There's a long history behind that. But this bread needed to be broken. Now, whether this reference to devoting themselves to the teaching of the apostles, to fellowship and breaking of the bread, whether the breaking of the bread is a reference to celebrating the Lord's table or just eating meals, today's not the day to have that debate. But you'll notice down in verse 46, there's another reference to breaking bread. And then there's a reference, the fourth thing they devote themselves to is prayers. Prayers, not the prayer, prayers. Okay, how do I say this? You all know the Lord's Prayer. You need to remember something about the Lord's Prayer. First, it was an example Jesus gave his disciples of how to pray. Excuse me while I get a little off the track here. But that example is really important because the first four things you say in the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, I hate to tell you this, but you're not important enough to make those things happen. You are important enough to know they're going to happen and to acknowledge that God in his sovereignty is going to bring them about, and that you confess that you agree with what God is going to do. Now this, we can have a discussion about whether this was half of the prayer or more than half of the prayer. But the recognition that God is your Father, whether you like it or not, that's part of prayer. And that he is in heaven, and his name is hallowed, and his kingdom is coming, and his will is going to happen. That's part of your confession. And when you pray, that's part of your prayers. Confessing and agreeing with what God is doing. Simple. Not so much. Sometimes it's hard to say that. The second part of the prayer, forgive us our debts. No, I skipped one. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are our debtors. Forgive us our trespasses, just a different translation, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Those petitions are petitions that really are things we need, we're asking God for. The other three, you're just acknowledging what God is going to do. Now, one other comment about prayer. It's not on the overhead, but Ephesians chapter 6. All your ears perk up, right? You all know what Ephesians chapter 6 is? Come on, what's in Ephesians chapter 6? The armor of God, spiritual warfare. You put all of this stuff on so you can resist Satan. Please also notice that when you get to verse 18 in chapter 6, stand up, put on all of this stuff, stand all the while praying, okay? Praying. Pray at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. In other words, really pray. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance. Remember we said they devoted themselves? Well, that word devoted themselves is the same as the word perseverance. Put on the armor, collect all the armor. Stand up and pray. The armor is no good to you if you fall asleep. Obvious, right? No. Because we collect all the armor and then we doze off. The admonition in Ephesians is collect the armor and stay awake and pray. And while you're praying, you pray for yourself and you pray for all of the saints. Enough said about prayer. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, and prayers. That pretty much tells you what was their list of priorities. Verse 43, fear came upon them. In the Old Testament, fear falls on people. Fear came upon every soul, which is just an emphatic way of saying every one of them were afraid. But you need to understand something about being afraid. Afraid is what happens when you get surprised by the guard dog you didn't know was there. Fear is what happens when somebody threatens you. Fear might be what happens when the lights go and pull you over to the side of the road, but maybe not. But fear is also a sense of reverence. And fear is also that sense of the presence of God. And I was reminded this week while preparing this about when I preach, there are certain people in my experience who have prayed for me before I have preached. And it makes preaching a whole lot easier. Why? Because when these people pray for me, and have prayed for me, and do pray for me, the fear of the Lord, that sense of awe, the sense of the Holy Spirit being part of what you're doing when you're preaching, that's the fear of the Lord. And that's what fell on them, on every last one of them. In other words, they're in this group, and there's no doubt in their minds that God is working and God is doing things. And what happens as a result? Many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. Wonders. That's the weird stuff that's contrary to nature, like axe heads floating. Signs, that's the stuff by which you recognize somebody. Jesus performs a miracle. That's a sign so that you recognize his divinity, that he's the Son of God. That's what they're talking about. You might just wrap it all up and call it miracles. But there was fear, a sense of God's presence with every one of them. And there were signs and there were wonders. We always say signs and wonders. I don't know why. The Greek is always wonders and signs. Weird. And all who believed, verse 44, were together. Now, here comes the hard part. All who believed were together. Communal living? Maybe. Eventually it became that for some people. They had all things in common. They shared all of their stuff. I used to have a colleague. He's now teaching somewhere else. I've retired. But he was First Nation, and he explained some things to me about First Nations. The sense of property. This is mine, that's yours, is very foreign to First Nations. And the result was, it caused problems, and how I found out about this, we got talking one day. My wife would come home and complain about stuff that had happened at the hospital. I would tell my friend Ray about this, and he'd laugh, and he'd say, you don't get it. Illustration. Mother shows up at hospital with a toddler. The hospital lends her a stroller. She never brings it back. Did she steal it? In First Nations thinking, no. You didn't even lend it to me. It's just all of it's ours. You got that? And if it's ours, what's the big push to bring it back? It's just a different way of thinking. And these people, these Christians, they were all together, and they had all things in common. They went so far as to sell their possessions and their goods and distributed them to everyone, as any of them had need. Now, it helps if you think Jesus is coming tomorrow and you're not going to need this stuff. That helps. It helps if you're from a different culture where personal possessions are not the be-all and end-all of your existence. That helps. It also helps if you live in a society that has gone so far, so wrong, so bad, that groups are actually moving out and living in the wilderness to get away from it. So there's a group at the Dead Sea called the Qumran, and there's a group of people called Essenes, and in Egypt there's a group of people called Theraputai. And you remember the Pythagorean theorem? But you never expected to hear about that from your math class. You know, that's the thing about the triangle. This one squared added to this one equals this one squared. Remember that? No, you don't. The Pythagoreans lived in a community. The Qumran people, the Essenes, the Theraputai, they all lived in a community. They shared their property. They all had rules. We have some of those rules. The Pythagorean rules became the standard for most monasteries, where all property was held shared. You may know of a community in New York called Oneida, Oneida. They made silverware, cutlery, knives and forks. That's how they paid for their community. Eventually became a very big business. But that was a Christian community that just saw the evil in the world and decided to go and live in a separate community. Then there were the Millerites in the 19th century. Everybody went and sold everything, lived in tents on the river because Jesus was coming in October. And when Jesus didn't come, that's a whole ugly story in itself. Then you have Hutterites, and you have Mennonites, and you have Moravians. And if you haven't made it into my list, I apologize. Tell me what to put in the list, and I'll add it next time. Because this is very much part of our tradition, where people call themselves out of society to live separately, to live distinctly, to share things, to get their materialism under control, there is no room for Madonna's material girl in these kinds of groups. It goes so far as a whole bunch of them become ascetics, where they live on less and less and the least they can. Many of these groups did not marry. They replaced themselves by taking in orphans. This was how they lived, but that's yet to come. But it was already there in the Greek and Roman world. And this Christian community would have looked very much like any one of them. Now, before you start telling me we should live like they lived in the book of Acts, and the church should be more like the church in the book of Acts, let me remind you about verse 44. They lived together and had all things in common, and they sold their possessions and goods and distributed it to everyone, as many as had need. I've always been amazed that we want to live like the book of Acts, but we don't want to go quite that far. Okay? Now, if some of you want to go that far, go for it. But also let me warn you that when you go for it, I can't give you a percentage, but I think it's probably close to 90% of these things end up being disasters. Just end up becoming disasters. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. That doesn't mean they can't be done better. But that's what they were like. It's just not what we're like. Day by day, verse 46, each and every day, they persevered, here's that word again, in the temple, together. Well, let me just say something about the temple. This is not a temple. You are sitting in a square box with heat. This is not a temple even in Palestine. If you wanted to make this look like the temple, here's what you do. You empty out the parking lot. You put a fence around the whole place, all of the property. You have one building in it, that's the temple. The rest of it is also the temple. And in that open area, people come and gather. And they built a wall to keep other people out. And at one point in that precinct, there was a line. I don't know if it was red or white or what color. There was a line, and there were signs on the line. And we have the signs. They're in museums in Turkey. The sign said, Gentiles, don't go any further. It'll be bad for your health. In other words, Gentiles, if you go any further, you're going to get killed because you're not holy. You with me? I have a little friend in my shirt who needs to be put out of his misery. Okay, he's out of his misery. So that's what the temple looked like. What you realize when you think about this, people would show up and they would meet and they would talk. And there were groups here and there and everywhere. So, you know about the Church of the Cross. You know about the Church of the Baptistry. You know about the church of this and the church of that. This was more like the church of the foyer. What went on the other side of those doors before Doug called you in here and asked you to come in and be seated? It's more like what happens when we all stand up to leave. chaos. That's what this temple precinct was like. Everybody talking to everybody else. Incidentally, if you look at floor plans for synagogues that have been excavated, they're usually square. In the center is a square platform where the chief leaders sat. Jesus would have been invited up to read scripture and comment on it. What's going on around him? There were no pews. The best the synagogues could do is a row of benches around the outer wall. Everybody stood. What's even crazier? Everybody talked. There's some guy up there teaching, but everybody else is in conversations of 2 or 3 people chatting away. That would drive us nuts, because we're good European types and we sit. We've got this thing about Europeans. You have 6 people into your house, you have to have 7 chairs. The possibility that somebody would sit on a floor is just verboten, as the Germans would say. Impossible. But these people talked all the time. They were interrupted all the time. I used to say to my students, I used to have students that bring their kids to class. A little kid would squawk, and a student would get upset. And I'd say, get over it. Man, when you're preaching, who knows what's going to happen in that congregation? So one of my professors, Dr. Sam Sandmel, an interesting dude, ordained rabbi, PhD in New Testament. 4 of us are sitting in his office having a seminar one day, and he looks at the 4 of us. Now, the 4 of us, 3 evangelicals, 1 Jewish kid. He looks at the 4 of us and he says, you know the problem with you Christians is? And we're looking at him and going like, no, doctor, we don't, but you're going to tell us, right? And he says, yeah, I'll tell you. The problem with you Christians is we gave you your Messiah, and all we got back in exchange was the pew. We gave you your Messiah, and all we got in exchange was the pew. Synagogues did not have pews. Everybody stood around. Now, while I was in Cincinnati, Dr. Sandmel died. And my friend Dan took me to the funeral. And after the funeral, we were having a discussion about Christian funerals and Jewish funerals. And one of the things I said to Dan, he said, what did you think? And I said, well, one of the things I thought was, geez, all those kids, it was a funeral. There were kids running around and screaming all over the place. It was really noisy. And he started to laugh. And he explained to me that he had said that once too, in the presence of an old guy who had been a Holocaust survivor. And his observation, the old guy's observation was, get over it. Kids and noise are a good thing. I remember, the Jewish guy said, when there were no children. So noise in the synagogue, people talking, noise in the temple, people talking, this was just part of life. It was a good part of life. So every day, they went down to the temple. They also, every day, broke bread in their homes. That's probably a reference to eating meals together. They partook of their food. It might have been bread. You need a hammer to break. But they partook of their food with glad and generous hearts. You notice the attitude, glad and generous hearts. Verse 47, praising God. And I find this part really interesting. Finding favor with all the people. They were not known as irritants, troublemakers. They weren't John the Baptist types, or Ralph Nader, if you remember who he was before he became a politician, or Bob Dylan types, or the various popular singers we've had in our recent history, protesting and picketing. That wasn't the reputation among Christians. They were well liked by the community. The Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. That's how Luke describes the early church. What I would like to suggest to you is that maybe we need to temper our idealism and our desire that everything be perfect, because God is perfect. And we come to own the fact that what we think is perfect maybe isn't so perfect. We have romantic views of what worship should be like, and perhaps we need to temper those. Maybe we should pay more attention to things like the verse in Philippians 4, verse 11. Paul says, it's not that I'm complaining of want, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Or Timothy chapter 6, verse 6, there is great gain in goodness with contentment. Or Timothy 6, 8, if we have food and clothing, we shall be content. Or Hebrews 13, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never fail you nor forsake you. So here's my point. A few years ago when I first started attending Crossfield Baptist, I led some Sunday school discussions about what church should be like, specifically what should be in a worship service. And there were some people who thought we should have this, and some people who thought we should have that. And so I made a practice of breaking them into groups and trying to get them to design the ideal worship service. What should the church look like when they meet? And given the constraints we put on it, it only can be an hour long. You know, we did that Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, and nobody ever came up with a worship plan that incorporated all the things that group wanted. And there were only 6 of them at the table, and they couldn't get to the point where they agreed about everything. What my message to you this morning is look at that early church. There were some things that were important. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. They broke bread. They prayed. Keep it simple. God blesses when there's a sense of his presence.